quick.
Welcome to the 51st episode of the Animal Riot podcast, brought to you by Animal Riot Press, a literary press for books that matter. It's your host, Brian, here. If you're new to the Animal Riot community, welcome, and you can find out more about us at animalriotpress.com. Now on to the episode, You Filthy Animals, with today's guests. I'm going to introduce you because I'm feeling despotic today. I'm feeling tyrannical. Devin Kelly. Hi, Devin.
Do I say hi?
Jared.
Hi.
Marcel Pollen.
Ahoy.
Jared, how do you feel about the middle name? Is that like your calling card literarily?
Yeah, well, that was my great grandfather's name on my mother's side, and that is my official author's name. Yes, and I insist on being introduced in triple-barreled form every time.
Okay, good. We're gonna discuss that later. Actually, you'll see. So we got Devin, we got Jared, we got George Sawaya, we got Seth Katz, and I believe that's everyone. Have I left anyone out? The no-namers say. Anyway, yes, I said I was feeling... I've made a unilateral decision today. I might seem a little jittery. If I do, it's because I've been up since 4:30 this morning, cleaning up dog shit and dog vomit. I woke up to the smell of literal dog shit, and in the dark. And I looked around for a few minutes, got back in bed, decided that there had to be dog shit somewhere in the room, got up again, searched, found the dog shit, and
did you search in the dark?
I searched. I was like, I didn't. You know how like you get up early and you really don't want to turn on the light, like that. It was like that.
Yeah.
So I was kind of like, I was risking stepping in it while like looking around with my cell phone. Yeah, it was wild.
So where was it?
And it was like at the corner of the bed, like at the bottom of the bed, at the foot of the bed. But it was kind of like near one of my suitcases, so like it was, I don't know, it was difficult to find. And since the smell kind of like just consumed the entire room, but like, that didn't really I couldn't really follow my nose. But anyway, this dog Kirby that's staying with me was just like, he's just like shitting his brains out this morning, and then he vomited just about an hour ago. So I'm feeling bad for him,
Exodus from all orifices, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, when I get very little sleep, I get really jittery. So
I smell, no pun intended, a nonfiction piece emerging from this. Maybe
that's
I was
true.
just gonna say you should.
Dog Shit in the Dark by Brian.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need to work on like a collection of essays about your encounters with dogs. You already had that one. I can't remember where you published it, but the one about Rosetta. I mean, this sounds like another one in the making.
Yeah.
Just do a few more, and that's a book.
It's a little bit of a different tone, but yeah.
Well, you need the range.
Variety.
You can't have a one-tone book.
They can't all be about fecal matter.
Does the app you use allow you to rate the dogs like based on their performance in your custody? Like 1 star shit everywhere? Like,
yes, they
dog.
do. That's exactly what Rover does. They allow you to rate the dog afterwards, and every dog I've taken care of has gotten 5 stars. So
What
Kirby's really gotta pull through here.
what like a slight tangent, but what I was thinking about this the other day. What app or service like began the obsession with rating our services? Was it Yelp?
Probably Yelp. I mean, wow, yeah, it's a big question. Definitely not Yelp. I mean, like Yelp was like the Google, like the Google of rating. That was like the
Rate My Professor from the producer.
I mean, I'm gonna have to say, like, probably Mark Zuckerberg when he did the rating, like the hot or not thing at Harvard.
It's
Face smash.
It's interesting that like at the because we now live in like a rating conscious society, right? Like Goodreads, Uber, Yelp. And what's interesting about it, and I know this isn't the subject of our conversation.
I don't give a shit. Let's talk about it.
But what's interesting about it is that like the prevalence of ratings now has made it that ratings are essentially meaningless. They're like if you need 4 or 5 stars out of 5 in order to be considered a worthy business or service, and like 3 stars out of 5, which used to mean good, now means bad, right? Would you agree?
Right. Yes. It's become weaponized.
We're
Like
not
every
good at
star.
rating things at all.
Well, if you're rating on a 5-star scale, I mean, if you're giving someone 3 stars, that might still be good, but I mean, you're still knocking some points off for some reason. One would have
Yeah.
to, if you're a fair-minded rater and not just someone who just gets on their phone and just, angrily, punches in whatever experience they just had.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, we're as a society, we only give things 1 star or 5 or maybe 4. Like, very rarely do I see the thoughtful 2 or 3 star review.
Or we just pay or extort people to give certain ratings. That's probably
true.
what happens more often.
I recall that review for that barbecue joint in Mississippi that we came across when we were
Oh,
traveling.
Where you go when you're there.
It's
you
where
go
I
when you're
go when
there.
I'm there. It's just, I mean, like, what an endorsement. That's 5 stars. That's got to be 5 stars.
Were there any stars attached, or was that?
I mean, I could do a little quick.
Yeah, well, I think the ultimate test to that is Rotten Tomatoes, because Rotten Tomatoes is not qualitative, it's quantitative. It just aggregates a bunch of different reviews and assigns a percentage rating to it, but it's not about the subjective experience of seeing the movie at all. It's just yeah. So like in Rotten Tomatoes now is like the authority on movies. People want to know like what it get on Rotten Tomatoes, as if that's somehow an indication of the movie's quality.
I think Rotten Tomatoes is an especially good example because they are assigning a positive or negative value to a review that may be, very nuanced and very mixed. Rotten Tomatoes,
yeah.
I mean, they will log a review by a critic and they will say this is either fresh or it's rotten. And then that, determines the overall percentage, the aggregate. But I mean, you may have a review that is very much in the middle and and someone has to come in and read that review and decide if it's fresh or not.
Do you think a human does that, or do you think they have an algorithm that like searches for positive and negative? Yeah. There's no way a human does that. It should be
Rotten Tomatoes isn't like Metacritic, is it? It doesn't aggregate other stuff, does it?
Yeah, that's what it is. It is an aggregator.
Yeah, it is Metacritic. It's the same as Metacritic.
No different. So it is Metacritic now.
It's Metacritic at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, the deliberate removal of nuance, which is the essence of tyranny.
It's funny too. I was looking at Goodreads. Like, technically, each star, like I'm pretending to rate a book on Goodreads now, and 1 star is did not like it. 2 stars is it was okay. 3 stars is liked it. 4 stars is really liked it, and 5 stars is it was amazing. So the spectrum is. There's only 1 star that says you don't like it, and it's the 1 star one.
What was 2 stars again? It
2
was
stars
okay.
It was okay, which like I saw that I remember seeing this like probably a few months ago because I'm starting to rate books I read on Goodreads in order to keep track of what I'm reading. And I went through and then I re-reviewed a bunch of books I had read because I was like, I thought that 3 stars was okay, but apparently 2 stars is.
If I saw 2.5 on Goodreads, I would say this is a below average book. And I will say
so the audience perceives the stars differently.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Specifically to Goodreads, if you have a book outside the 3.5 to 3.9 range, it's an extraordinary phenomenon just in itself. Because the average of everyone just rating a book, it's actually kind of what one of the things I wanted to talk about today when in relating sort of the qualitative perspective on literary achievement versus say athletic achievement. In Goodreads, if you have enough people rating a book, it's look at every book on Goodreads. So many of them fall between that range of 3.5 to 3.9. It's incredible. Yeah. It's just
it should though, right? Because that's what an average is, right?
Yeah. So there's an average where people are willing, there's an average score that people are willing to give. So they decide their own range of what means average. So Devin, you're re-rating everything based on their scale. People have made their own fucking scale.
Yeah. I mean,
if they're 3.5 to 3.9.
If someone gave my book 3 stars on Goodreads, which has happened, it makes me sad.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Just because it's outside that range. That's the only reason.
It means that they didn't like it. That's what it means. Even though for Goodreads it means liked it.
Yeah, let's look up a book on Goodreads. What's a classic book? Just
To Kill a Mockingbird.
A masterpiece.
To
Kill a Mockingbird.
That's a universally loved book. It seems. I don't know too many people who don't like.
Well, I'm not sure which point you're trying to prove.
I want to see what the rating is.
When I was growing up in
4.28. So yeah,
Okay.
so that's a it's definitively outside the range.
right
What's the-
cannot be disputed.
Let's look up.
Did
Look up,
anybody give it a 1 star?
look up-
Like, let's read a
Brian.
1-star review of To Kill a
Brian,
Mockingbird.
look up like A Little Life, like because that was like everyone's darling, or like Goldfinch, the Goldfinch.
Let's do the Goldfinch.
It's outside
That
of
one
the
really
mean
liked.
deviation. It's outside of the bell curve.
3.92.
There it
Look
is.
at that.
That's just a hair.
And there
Yeah.
it is, 3.92. I swear to God, it's like if I used to play this game on Goodreads, which means I have a lot of time on my hands, and I really just am just a consummate failure. If because I'm looking up, I'm I'm like I once had this idea that I was going to write a book based on like a meta data sort of thing, where I was just going to take ratings from like Reddit, like basically like qualitative ratings from Reddit, and convert them into like some sort of quantitative rating. But anyway, long story short, I've looked up a lot of books on Goodreads, and the range between 3.5 and 3.9 is an actual, like, I feel like who wrote the Tipping Point? What's his fucking name?
Gladwell.
Jesus Christ. Yeah, Gladwell. Gladwell could write a groundbreaking book on the 3.5 to 3.9.
I don't know that
range on
Gladwell can
Goodreads.
write a
I swear to
groundbreaking
God.
book on any topic, but
Okay, well, yeah, that's
I'm sorry.
that was inherent. It was inherent to what I said, but I appreciate you making it obvious for all of our fucking Philistines out there. Anyway, let's talk about what I want to talk about, because I've made an executive, like as I said, tyrannical, despotic, etc., decision to talk about writing through the prism of The Last Dance. And I want to talk about it because it single-handedly motivated me to write again. Like, not that I wasn't writing before this, but I just want to say, I want to make this admission for all of us, that we recorded an episode before this, and we decided that, did we collectively decide that it was shit?
I think we
Is that how it
followed the
went
lead of
Okay, yeah, of our producer, of our lovely producer, yeah. Yeah, Katie said it was shit, and we all nodded our heads, because if we didn't, we were going to get sent to the fucking gulags out in Siberia. So, anyway, yeah, so we were talking about the pandemic and how it was affecting our creativity. I don't know how I feel about that. Let's hold off on that.
Well, should we just
now,
say maybe
but-
that the consensus was, for the most part, that it wasn't very good for our creativity?
Yeah, I would say that. Like, yeah, let's throw that in there.
exception of myself, of
We'll
course.
see what
obviously.
yeah, right. Sure. Yeah, and we'll come back to that. Anyway, this is the second time I've seen The Last Dance, and I don't think any of you have seen it,
I've
right?
seen it.
Except George,
I've
you said
watched
you were watching it at
Yeah.
some point? You've
I've
watched
seen it too, yeah.
Okay. And it's not really important. The important thing here is that, we all agree that Michael Jordan is either the greatest or one of the greatest basketball players of all time. And he has a mentality that's just, I think a lot of people would agree that he's the greatest because of his mind more than his ability. Like, by the latter years of his career, he was still reeling off championships, even though he was nowhere near the athletic specimen he was before he was ever winning championships, And I was just so deeply intrigued as like, why was this documentary motivating me to write? Clearly it had to do with that mentality, Like, I wanted to achieve like some sort of greatness, like whether people recognize it or not, like there's this drive to be great, and I don't really understand it. It's like it's just such an enigma to me, and I'm so interested in it that I want to get your takes on it, honestly. And I have a couple of whatever you want to fucking call them, talking points. What are podcast hosts supposed to say?
Thinking points, maybe. Well, I should say, just right out of the gate here, because we knew we were going to talk about this today, I dipped into the Both Flesh and Not essay by Wallace on Federer just before we started this podcast.
Right.
And what he says at the end of that essay is that genius is unreplicable, but it's always inspiring. And that genius does inspire, even though we understand it to be singular and something that cannot be replicated or cannot be chased.
Interesting. There you go. Well, I guess shut it down. We're done.
Well, the idea, like the recognition that genius is a kind of singular thing, that you'll never be the person who inspires you the most, but that person inspires you nonetheless.
Yeah. I wonder do you have to love the thing that the person is genius at in order to feel that inspiration? Because I love basketball. Do you guys give a shit? Like,
I mean,
only George, you watch The Last Dance. you kind of don't give a shit about basketball. What was your reaction?
I mean, basketball is not part of my sporting repertoire. I tend not to really tune in all that much. You maybe March Madness or something, but I mean, like,
you won't catch George dribbling around the streets.
no, I'm
of
not out there
Birmingham.
doing layups.
Not even in the pre-dawn
and-
hours getting you dribbling in.
Pre-dawn crossovers in the driveway.
lacing up some track shoes and doing full
While
court jumpers.
Brian's cleaning up dog
Yeah, I
shit,
enjoy
you're just hammering free throws back against the garage door.
I mean,
That's our literary.
it's amazing to watch anyone at the top of their game, no matter what it is that they do.
Yes, that's a fact.
We were supposed to have the Tokyo Olympics this year, unfortunately, which have been pushed back to next year.
Oh shit!
I am a huge Olympic sports fan.
Yeah.
I don't care what the hell it is. I'll be screaming at the television, half drunk, at like water polo, like Italian men's team water polo.
Yeah.
Fucking crushing it, you know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
But like one of the things that I can't claim to have any kind of appreciation for, like outside of watching it, is gymnastics. But when I watched Simone Biles, the great American gymnast, absolutely destroy world competition in the last gymnastics, I was over the moon. I was her biggest fan in the world. I don't know the first thing about a balance beam or like what being good at this looks like, but I know that she was fucking unbelievable. So it's just amazing to watch anyone like at a certain level of competency, especially at that level of competency, like just be competent, so overwhelmingly competent at what they're doing. You have to admire that because I mean, you I think you instinctively think about all the hours that it takes and all the drive that it takes. I always think about genius as like a confluence of a great many attributes and chance encounters. I always think about Michael Phelps. He's designed to be a swimmer. His hands are perfect for being a swimmer. His body is perfect for being a swimmer. But I mean, he still had to like have the opportunity to go and get in the pool, right? He still had to have a mother who was supportive of taking him, as often as he wanted to go to swim. And like, it's just this great many things happened so the world could have Michael Phelps, right?
It's so interesting you say that because, like, I came into watching The Last Dance. It's the polar opposite sort of inspiration that you take from greatness because, like, my singular thought about it is why? Like, why did Michael Phelps do that? Like, why? Like, yeah, there's so many. Because okay, here's what I learned about greatness over my 31 years. It is not enjoyable. Overall, I don't, and I think this is one of the things I wanted to talk to you guys about it. Like, why do people do it? What's the motivation? Because it's not enjoyable. To be that great is not enjoyable. The rewards are some sort of spiritual fulfillment that so far transcend the basal desires that we have, like to fuck or feel good or eat or blah blah blah. Like, why did Michael Phelps do it? Why did Michael Jordan do it?
I think
why. That's what I'm so intrigued.
I think like George said something about watching Simone Biles that I think is key, which is like there's being very, very good at something and then there's being great at something. And like when you watch Simone Biles, like he said, Simone Biles destroys the rest of the competition, which is like what Usain Bolt did. It's what Michael Phelps did, which is like, and it's why watching greatness at the Olympics is like such a profound thing, because if you watch someone like Simone Biles, you're watching her compete against literally the best gymnasts in the world, and like then they can't even hold a candle to her, and like they are made to look mediocre by comparison. And so to your point, Brian, I think like that level of greatness, you have to like, you don't just sort of sacrifice all the things that are cliche to sacrifice, like time and relationships and energy or whatever. Like you also sacrifice, I think, a relationship to the world that is grounding and puts you in solidarity with the great number of us who lay claim to our mediocrity. And like, and I think,
or just being a normal, or just being a normal
and I think
person.
That's where, like, I think at some point everyone in their life makes a decision, whether or not it's conscious or not, to like to choose communion, like communion with
Yeah.
a relatively large or small, mediocre and human few, or to pursue individual distance from that level of communion. Because like, yeah, you're right, like anyone who achieves that level of greatness, whether it's Taylor Swift who put out a new album today or Michael Jordan, it's not Seth made a face, but like it, we don't have to be critically, you don't have to be critically great, I think, to be great. But like you sacrifice that relationship to the world that like treats you as a human being. You become superhuman. You can't return to the world again.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite parts of The Last Dance, where he basically there's a huge segment of one of the episodes, one of the 10 episodes, where it's basically like he's holed up in a hotel room and he's like I'm done after this year because I cannot wait to not have 5,000 people outside my door, and like blah 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 blah. Like he doesn't want to do it, and yet it's the only thing he wants.
I think what part of what you're talking about, this drive to kind of reach this exalted level, above the rest of us mere mortals. I mean, these are people making themselves into gods, almost in a literal way. I mean, they are worshipped as gods. They are remembered. I mean, the fact that we're talking about Michael Jordan and not someone else is because of that level that he reached. I think that is probably, at some subconscious level and at a very basic fundamental level is part of the drive toward greatness. But I mean, down this road also is madness. I mean, you look at someone like Bobby Fischer, who was so committed to becoming the best chess player of all time. And, I mean, he, obviously, went down a really bad road mentally. Or, in terms of the imitation of genius, as an avid listener of jazz, I'm always thinking about Charlie Parker and about those who tried to emulate Charlie Parker and thought that his genius was due to his heroin use. And so you had this whole generation of jazz musicians who started taking heroin, thinking that it would make them play like.
Yeah, I mean, Charlie Parker's a byword for like 10 other jazz musicians of that like.
No. But I mean, but Charlie Parker was.
What you're saying is completely true.
Yeah, well, the reason I think of him is because, I mean, he is just, without a doubt, one of, maybe three most influential jazz musicians in history. But in terms of that emulation that we were talking about earlier, or sort of the drive to imitate, despite the fact that you'll never reach that level. I mean, there end up being a lot of casualties of greatness, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Chet Baker himself, like not other people that tried to emulate him. Himself, he believed he needed heroin to play.
Yeah, and I think when you apply this, as we eventually will, to literature, it becomes really complex and sort of. I've been thinking about this a lot, like what you sort of. I like your turn of phrase, Seth. Casualties of greatness. I think as writers and as a writer myself.
And artists in general,
it's like
where you're about to say.
I think living now, I miss the way I wrote before I began to care about what other people thought about.
And that's exactly, dude, what you just said is like, yeah, you just phrased something that I've been thinking about way better than I did.
I'm a writer.
There's a sort of, because, and that's the thing here, here's what I'm going to put out there, and not to kind of like totally lay waste to how you've been approaching writing for the last several years, but like watching The Last Dance made me realize I felt like I was doing it all wrong and that I needed to totally reset like where I was coming from in terms of writing. I was like, because Michael Jordan is so great because he's totally zen. He doesn't give a fuck what happened before. He doesn't give a fuck what's going to happen. He doesn't give a fuck what other people think. He doesn't give a fuck how you should do it or how other people think you should do it. All he gives a fuck about is playing the game to perfection, and like he's going to do it in any way that leads to a victory,
it kind of goes to what I was going to say earlier, actually, which is that genius is this kind of like non-negotiable relationship with the world. Like geniuses don't negotiate with the reality that they're born into. Like they kind of, they shape it for themselves.
or the perceived
perceived
reality,
reality,
right?
sure.
Like the delusions or illusions that, like, you know, that get in the way, the distractions, all
Frankly,
that
that's
shit.
I
Like,
think that's so many
which
geniuses die young, and I mean maybe part of why we think they're geniuses is because they didn't have time to, you know, sort of develop their talents, or you know,
Yeah, or
Or to get
fall from
sloppy.
grace. But I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I think about some of these really prolific geniuses like John Coltrane or Fassbinder, the filmmaker, you know, who died in their 30s. And you know, there is that kind of idea of burning the candle at both ends. And I think at some level, some of these folks, you know, at some cosmic level of consciousness, realize that they have a limited time, and they really kind of, I mean, these people just explode. Their talent just completely incinerates everything around it.
So what about Devin's point about kind of missing the way that you were writing before you started caring
yeah.
what other people think?
Mhm.
What about that?
Well, I was thinking after I said that like I don't think any sort of conversation of particularly writing it, but I guess this applies to all art and this notion of genius. Like there is a distinction obviously between writing and publishing, and I think that the notion of publishing as a world, like there are people who navigate the publishing world with the same zen-like mentality, and it has less they have less it's less about their concern for art and more about their concern for like themselves and getting the work out there. And so there are people who like network and like who are ferocious in their ability,
they're
ruthless
ruthless.
ruthless
They're
to
ruthless.
scale the
Yes.
sort of industrial corporate ladder of publishing, which is interesting and different than the person who is like that sort of figure we often associate with literary genius, like the sort of troubled mind locked up in the room or the mad woman in the attic.
The
Those
outsider
sort of,
artist.
yeah, those sort of figures. And it's fascinating in this moment, in this contemporary moment, because we can all sort of like open up our computers and bear witness to like the various minds at work of our age. And it like, yeah, and so it's such a complicated thing to talk about today, because like I think yes, there are those sort of like outsider artists, as you were saying, Seth, who probably pursue their art, or as you were saying, Jared, like who have a sort of singular view of the world and pursue it with reckless abandon in their own room. But then there are people who like publish 10 books in 20 years and are, you know, critically acclaimed authors. And I don't know, it's just like those twin notions of writing and publishing are so separate in our moment now, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's because literature is complicated by not just subjectivity, like in the most like generic sense, but also like, yeah, you have to like, in order to make it, quote unquote, you have to want to do things that have to do nothing, that have
Yeah.
nothing to do with writing. And like, I feel like that's like a decision you have to make. That's what makes like literary genius and like athletic genius, for example, so different. Athletic genius is like, if you want it enough but you're 5'2" and you love basketball, okay, the decision's been made for you. Unless you're Muggsy Bogues, you're not going to make it. But if you're good enough,
Yeah,
you're
but
gonna make it, because it's an objective league. You're gonna fucking do
well,
better
I was
than
gonna say,
everyone else. In literature,
well,
yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
there's also like it's like there's an objective reality as to what good is. Like, so it's like
Yeah,
if you're
exactly.
actually if you're 5'2", but you can for some reason hit 12 half court shots in a row.
Like if
Yeah,
you're Steph Curry,
or
essentially.
if
I
you're
mean, you know, not
yeah,
you're
or
you're
if
a
you're
foot
five
taller,
two
but
and you get on a track and run like a 9.700 meter dash, like you're, you know.
yeah, yeah.
But the literature landscape is complicated because like no one has like good is and will always be, I think, a relative concept. And
Yeah, well,
And also,
athletic genius is demonstrable. Like if you score like 63 points in a game, like there's no
Mm-hmm.
arguing with that. If you're a great athlete and you blow everybody else out of the water in like the 200-meter dash or whatever, like there's no arguing with that. But you know, literature is a gated world, and you can send a genius manuscript to every editor in New York, and they could all be like, "Yeah, doesn't work for me."
but it's also like what you just said. It's genius is not demonstrable. Like explain the theory of relativity to a million people, and so many people are gonna get it. You know, it's not. You can't shove literary greatness down people's throats. And so that's why, like, more than so the question became so much more complicated for me when I watched The Last Dance, because it's not only why would you pursue this, because even if you achieve, it's not really enjoyable. But it's also, for us, it's like, why would you do something that literally has like no benefits?
Well, I don't
Like,
know if
you know?
I don't know if I'd say it's not enjoyable. I mean, it's a passion, and a passion by definition is like a state of suffering, and like you have to suffer what you love. And anyone who's ever loved anything, whether it's your wife or your children, or like you know what it is you do, writing, being an athlete, you have to. There's a component of suffering in loving anything, and I think that's really more what it's about. It's not that it's not enjoyable or that it's too difficult. You know, in the case of somebody like Jordan, like it wasn't sustainable. He knew he had to get out eventually. Yeah.
So what, Jared? What does that say about you? Because you love so little. Writing's it, man.
I mean, I think if there's a reason that that we end up pursuing a life in letters, it's because of probably experiences that we had in childhood or adolescence or maybe in college, where where we communed with something greater than ourselves by reading a book or through the process of putting pen to paper. And we know that there is something there. We may not connect with it every time we sit down at the writing desk, but we know that there is something out there that we can connect with in only that way. And also, just to the point about athletics, I think athletics are a useful analog for a number of different pursuits, but that analogy eventually breaks down at some level too. I mean, the reason it's a useful analogy is because of the kind of objective nature of it, because of the physical expression of it. So we often talk about, to students who are learning writing, we talk about it as a muscle. Writing is a muscle. You have to practice, you have to develop it, you have to, you have to stretch, however you want to. Yeah, exactly. And if you don't, then your talent is going to diminish. And it's funny. I mean, yeah, obviously it gets complicated when you start talking about the very subjective ways that people interact with art. And something can be very meaningful to one person and mean nothing to someone else. Case in point, Ezra Pound. But I do think that athletics continue to be a useful analogy in that sense as well. For what you were talking about, Brian, if you are 5'2", you have certain limitations that you may never be able to surpass if you want to be a great basketball player. And I think that's true of writing as well. I mean, some people just are more talented than others, and part of it is putting in the hard work and putting in the hours at the desk. Part of it has nothing to do with writing at all. It has to do with your ability to see the world, to understand, or at least have a perspective on the things around you. I think that is something that ties it to the athletic prowess that we're discussing as well. That there are limitations, and not everyone can be Michael Jordan just by by practicing 18 hours a day. That's not going to get you there.
Yeah, I would argue that there are two kinds of work involved in writing, just two. But I would argue the first work is cultivating a way of seeing the world, which I think is like a less talked about work, and I think a more difficult beneath the surface work, and like that's also a kind of work that has more to do with how you move through the world as a person. And then I think the second kind of work is cultivating a variety of specific ways of expressing and communicating the way you see the world, and that's done through reading, it's done through practicing your art, it's done through like by reading you internalize many different kinds of structures that can help you like better articulate the sort of architecture of the way you look at the world, or build the world around you. And then like I think sadly it doesn't stop. I think the work of writing is like those two things, but then the work of becoming a notable writer is this other work of like that's part luck and part drive, and like the drive is almost always there. The drive is in like how do you get that thing that you created out into the world, and like that's where things are separated. I often think of like the amount of sort of great novels that like will never see the light of day because no one gave, like they didn't have, the person writing them didn't have the drive for whatever good reason to sort of like continue trying to submit it or like continue trying to network it into the world. I don't know.
Yeah, and that really intrigues me as well. That kind of drive, like what, like the layers of drive in literature. Like, you know, in a basketball game, it's like I want to win. I want to win as many championships as I can. There's variations, like, you know, you can win MVPs, you can win scoring titles, you can blah blah blah. But it is a lot simpler. But more than that, like in literature, because it's so much more complicated, like how do you simplify the ways you motivate yourself? Like even Michael Jordan's methods of motivating himself are legendary, like legendarily like creative, you know. Like, I mean, part of the fun of watching The Last Dance was like how repetitive, how like humorously repetitive the way he motivated himself was, like in the sense of like I can't tell you how many times he'd be like, so they got to the 92 finals, and you know the media were like, okay, now it's the showdown between Clyde Drexler and Jordan, like finally we're going to see who the better player is. And then, like, you know, it cuts to them like interviewing Jordan, as they did for a lot of the documentary, and he's like, you know, they said he was on my level. I was like, okay, yeah, sure, yeah, we'll see about that. And like and it just repeated every time. And like in 97, Karl Malone won in the MVP. And he was like, okay, so they thought he was the MVP. I said, all right, I took it personally. We'll see about that. Like,
Yeah,
it just repeated and repeated.
yeah,
And it's like he simplified it. Like he just made up story. Like once he would make up stories. Like, well, there's this story about him and this dude, LeBradford Smith. LeBradford Smith was like a Washington Bullet back when the Wizards were the Bullets, and he drops 37, and Jordan's guarding him that game. And so they just so happened to play Washington again 2 nights later in Washington. And Jordan says, he tells the media that, like, you know, he's like, look, like LeBradford came up to me after,
right.
like,
Yeah,
after the game. He was like, nice game, Mike. And yeah, and so like, and so he tells everyone, he's like, I'm gonna score what he scored in that game in the first half, and he only scores 36 instead of 37, but in the first half, and he totally made that
Did he
shit
really?
up, like totally made it up, like it never happened.
Well, no, but
And it's not like that shit didn't
it's
happen.
clear from that
like, you know,
documentary
Reggie
though,
Miller
that
has a
Jordan
famous,
has like an elephant's memory for like every single slight he ever received from anybody.
yeah, everything. He said he literally has, like, you know, he calls it a list. And did he make
Yeah.
a list? No, the list is in his head. Like, you know, he was like, you know, when he retired to go play baseball, you know, Byron Russell came up to him, or Brian Russell, sorry, came up to him, and he was like, man, why'd you have to quit, man? Like, I could have guarded you. I could have shut you down. And like Michael's like, all right,
Yep.
like,
Yeah.
he was on my list after that. Like, you know. But like, you know, like how do you simplify that in writing, you know? Like what
That's
do
sort
you
of
do? Like how do you wake
it's
up and go,
fascinating
like,
too,
how,
because like
you know?
I love like you telling that reminds me of how like my brother will send me videos back when NBA was, well, I guess NBA is starting, right? Seth, is NBA starting? Okay.
Yeah,
My
yeah,
brother would send me
it just
videos every
started
once in a
again.
while, like of like a LeBron James press conference when like LeBron, they'll they'll like talk about like a play, and then like he does this all the time. Like he'll talk for like 5 minutes, breaking down exactly what he was thinking during the play and like where the defenders were, and like and the play had happened before, and he just like, it's like 5 minutes, and you realize they're always like so fascinating to watch because, and I was thinking about this as you were talking, because like I think with sports, you don't, the greatness looks so fluid on the court and so natural and so much a part of someone that you actually are surprised often when someone like Michael Jordan has like a list of past offenders, or when like LeBron James can actually break down like half second by half second what's happening on the court in hindsight, and like has like a perfect sort of attuned athletic memory. I don't know if that has nothing to do with what you asked, but I think as writers, you're expected to have that. It's part of the art. This sort of like, you're supposed to be smart.
Yeah, but what you said just it kind of does tie in the sense that, like, you know, like for example, to write like a really great novel, like to be a good writer, like just period, not even great. Like
Yeah.
you need to have that sort of memory. You need to have that sort of obsession. You know, if you don't remember where someone, you know, where Chekhov put the gun, you can't use it later. And like no one else is gonna remember that because they don't care enough or whatever. You know. where that comes from, though, again, is just this mystery to me that like I'll never understand, because like I don't display that sort of ability in like other things. Like I can't, like, for some reason when I'm writing I can remember that, but like I can't when I'm doing something else.
Well,
I don't know why.
to your point about, sorry, no, I was just going to say to your point about obsession. Like, in sports, the pursuit of greatness is like its own motivating factor. But I think that there is this sort of obsession, a sort of a fetishization with something that writing is doing for you, right? Whether it's like you just have a fetish for words, like I just love words, right? I think you have to have an appreciation for language, but like a fucking love, like I really, it gets me excited to discover like a word. It's just a lovely thing. If you go in, speaking of greatness in art, like if you go to the Met in New York, you can go up to and be like about 2 or 3 inches from Van Gogh's cypresses, right? And you just look at what he does with the paint. Like I think I may have mentioned this once or twice before, but it looks like he just went crazy. He went animalistic in the paint. He loves his paint so much, you can imagine that at one point he cast his brush aside and started using his tongue, or the tip of his dick. Like, he just
or
loves
his member,
it.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's more of a driver in like the individual pursuit of being a writer, right?
Yeah.
We're not after championships. I've never heard a writer say, "I'm going to get like 4 Nobel Prizes. I'm going to get that. I'm going to get that fucking Pulitzer."
And that's what's, George, what you just, and it's fitting that I'm going to bring this up now, because
Mailer.
you love Hemingway as well. But so many people don't. Well, so many people don't like Hemingway, or whoever is like that, Mailer, whoever's like that. But like, it was fine. It was totally fine in Hemingway's time to be like, I'm a better writer than you, and that
Yeah, that needs
brutal
to come
sort
back.
of competitiveness, and that's carried over in sport, but only to a certain degree. Like, even now when you hear LeBron say like, I'm the best player in the world, people will criticize him and say, well, Michael never had to say he was the best. Everyone just knew he was the best. He gets criticized for it. Like, I feel like I feel like in a way we're exiting a stage of humanity in which, like, win at all costs, brutal competitiveness is just like no longer in vogue. And it bothers me.
I think it's ideological. I think it's
I don't know if you guys agree
ideologically
with that.
ideologically in vogue. I don't think it's I think, to George's point, that's what George's point about like loving the medium, I think, is so apt. I don't see that discourse in the writing world as much as I would like to. People like really talking about like you don't hear people talking publicly about like someone's syntax or someone's turn of phrase, someone's ability, structures, like the things that happen on the word and paragraph level. You don't hear people talking about how DeLillo writes a single paragraph on a single page and then takes the page out of his typewriter, and that sort of love of medium is like relegated to, I think, like the ways in which we would talk about it as students. It's probably relegated to craft classes and drinks after workshop, and not like a larger discourse where I think like I think there is a deep competitiveness in the literary landscape, but I think it's ideological. I think it's about like, I think it's about the stuff you write about. It's not about how you write it.
I think the kind of competitive braggadocio that we associate with writers like Hemingway and Mailer is also associated with a certain kind of, brutish masculinity that is very much out of.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I was
Right.
gonna give the
Right.
disclaimer of like.
Well, I wasn't going to say toxic masculinity, but
and I was gonna say like. I was gonna say I'm wondering if whether like because it's not like there aren't women like that. Like, it's not. This isn't something confined to the male.
I was going to just kind of flip it around and say, I mean, the latest kind of cause for celebration in the literary world is Colson Whitehead becoming what people are calling the literary equivalent of an EGOT. The EGOT being, a performer who wins the Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, and Tony. And, Colson Whitehead has now won, I think, all the major literary prizes and is being roundly celebrated for that. And, I don't see Colson Whitehead going out and, proclaiming himself any kind of genius, but I think people are happy to see. I don't know that the writing community or the literary world is more supportive than it used to be, but I think there's more of an emphasis on on that very idea of the writing community that we keep hearing about, whether it exists or not. There's this kind of desire to have a supportive writing community, where we champion other people's work, and we appreciate other people's work, and we share other people's work, rather than that kind of more individualistic, drive toward my own personal success that, we may have seen more of in the past.
Yeah, well, two things about two things about that. The first one is that writers typically don't fit that profile. I mean, a few hypermasculine writers have, like Hemingway and Mailer, but generally, writers, especially these days, are very vulnerable creatures, and they're almost always modest or maybe falsely modest. At worst, we don't typically associate writers with that kind of arrogance.
Yeah.
It's not usually in their character, or at least it doesn't seem to be in their character. But not only that, the second thing is that, insisting on being a genius is typically not a very good look. I mean, you could be a genius, but if you go out and start calling yourself one, like then you start to look like you're full of yourself, and it never really, it's not received well generally. But if you want to be thought of as a genius, you're always able to persuade a certain number of people that you are. And my frame of reference for this in the world of art is a band like Oasis, for example. Like in the early 90s, like after Definitely Maybe was released and after Morning Glory, Oasis was arguably one of the biggest bands on the planet, and they always used to say, like, we're the best band. We write the best songs. We sell the most records. We play the biggest shows. Like, we're the best band. And everybody thought they were so arrogant, but they had the temerity to say that. And there's something to be admired about that. I mean, it's, I quite like that, actually.
Yeah. Well, and it's like it's obviously not binary in the sense of like you have to either do that or keep your mouth shut. It's like for example, like Bret Easton Ellis and David Foster Wallace didn't necessarily say, "Hey, I'm the best writer of all time," but they had their own little feud, and like that's sort of like Michael Jordan's sort of bone to pick, and I'm going to do better than you. Franzen and Wallace had like a quiet rivalry. And yeah, I mean, in terms of intellectual competitiveness, I mean, being smart kind of precludes you, in a certain sense. Being metaphysically intelligent kind of precludes you from going out and claiming yourself a genius, because you have to understand a certain sort of standing in the universe, right? Like humility. So. But it can come in different forms, though. You know what I mean? And I do think that, Devin, what you said about the ideological competition of like, what we're talking about. Yeah, I don't know. I'm less interested in that, to be honest, than like a sort of, you see Elon Musk. He's definitely pressing buttons ethically, but no one's denying his genius, and no one's denying what he's doing for society. And do I think it's like kind of driving him in a way? Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know where to take it from there, but I do wish it was kind of there with regards to writing, and it was less about that sort of like, oh, are you talking about this?
It's interesting what Jared said. I like about most writers not actually fitting that Hemingway sort of brutish profile, and it's related to what Seth said about like I think there is a sort of, the internet has created a community of writing that is like you can be a part of if you want to. And it's funny how the community of writing sort of treats people who just choose not to belong. I think Franzen is a really good example of someone who, like, I don't associate with Franzen the same sort of hyper masculinity that I associate with Hemingway. In fact, I find him to be sort of cute and awkward socially. I find him to be I don't think he knows how to act with people. Like, I don't. And I think that this gets him in a lot of trouble because like he doesn't have a social media presence, but then like you can be guaranteed that like once a year Jonathan Franzen will publish an article or a review or say something in like the New York Review of Books that will control the literary news cycle for 2 days. And everyone just gets mad at him. And I find it funny because it's just like, what is he like? We don't care. It's like when Laurie Moore published that thing that we were talking about like a week ago. Like, Laurie Moore is, I would argue, I love her novel, Who Will Run the Frog Hospital. I think it's one of my favorite novels of all time. And it's just like funny what like the writers who don't fit into the mold of like, I'm going to be a part of the community. And then like And like DeLillo's another great example. It's just like he just sort of sits there in his house, writes his novels, and every 5 years we get a DeLillo novel, and like there's a week of discourse about whether or not he's a genius, and then everyone who doesn't care about him stops talking about him, because part of being in the community means you have to talk about the thing everyone's talking about for a week and then not talk about it anymore. I don't know. It's just like we don't know what to do with people who don't fit the mold of what we want sort of in a writer today, which is to be supportive and generous and falsely modest.
Well,
And, like,
I guess
Yeah,
I guess probably the best.
and that kind of bothers me. I'm not gonna lie. Like I think that's what I'm touching on is like it bothers me that like writing has become equated with ethics, which in no way should that be the case, unless you're talking about journalism, reportage, something like that. Outside that, all we're doing is marching towards some sort of version of censorship, and like, okay, I'm taking it too far. Like, in general, like I do think like there should be more of, because do I think people are different now than they were 100 years ago? Absolutely not. It's just cultural. Like, no one says what Hemingway said because you're not supposed to anymore, but people are feeling
Well,
that.
to
People
pick
want to
up
be the best
on
writer.
what Devin was saying, and like not knowing what to do with people in the media landscape now, is that where George is showing us a picture of Papa from Life magazine. That's right. Hemingway was on the cover of Life magazine. When was the last time you saw a writer on the cover of that magazine?
Yeah.
Wait, let me see that again.
Is
George.
Life even a
Right
magazine
now.
anymore?
George, let me see
Do
it
we
again.
still have Life?
It's one of the only pictures of him smiling.
Oh my God.
It exists.
He looks amazing. He
What's
looks like
behind
an
him?
ad for visiting Montana.
What's
Yeah.
I know, isn't he great? Don't you just want to have a cigarette with that man?
Yeah,
Like,
that looks like an Old Spice ad.
Who's the guy from
Nick
Offerman?
Parks and
Yeah,
Rec?
Nick Offerman, Ron Swanson.
Yeah, it looks like him, and he should play Hemingway.
Well, I mean,
Hemingway
it can't.
in the,
I mean,
biopic.
he's bound to be better than Clive Owen.
yeah, Jesus.
Well, Corey Stoll.
Oh yeah, that was
let's
the
not
HBO special, right?
Sure, but Corey
They made-
Stoll in
HBO
Midnight
made
in
one.
Paris probably was.
Yeah, he was
great.
I don't think that can be topped.
Yeah, that was great. Again, but we're going into some.
Well, I'm wondering if
ethical
Jared can give us an
territory here.
assist from Lionel Trilling on this, because I mean, I think there's a difference between the way in which Trilling saw, literature as important in developing a liberal and democratic society, and the way in which we now demand, strong moral character in our literary works. I'm wondering if.
Well, actually, while you're thinking, Jared, one thing I only recently learned, and it is true. You can look it up. Is that like the MFA program as begun, like at a place like the University of Iowa, which I think is the first example of one, like was funded by the American government to create and cultivate a national voice in response to communism, and in response to like the fear of losing a sort of nationalistic, deeply American voice, if that makes sense. And like that's really interesting to me, is that our institutions that have now created like the sort of Updikes and Cheevers and into beyond, like are doing, I think, exactly what they're supposed to do, which is we're like every year the publishing industrial complex is publishing a bunch of books that like sort of uphold American values and ethics.
Yeah, I have conspiracy theories about that. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I feel like Top Gun was.
It was
honestly
well. Top Gun was
subsidized by
paid.
the-
Top Gun was paid. Was the Pentagon in part funded Top Gun? And if you look at
Yeah, there you go.
yeah, if you
See,
look
guys,
at
I'm a
U.S. naval
genius.
recruits, Top Gun was essentially a giant DoD funded recruiting video for the Navy, and like
Yvonne Netanyahu.
yeah, so we're not in like a new landscape now. Like I think the idea of literature, we just like people don't talk about the way literature actually has a function for government and for society, and like we like to think of artists as outcasts and critics, but most artists who are published fall into the camp of the opposite. They are people who uphold the status quo.
Well, okay, so it's difficult to kind of improvise an answer on this because Seth's question kind of caught me off guard. But
That's what I was trying to do.
That's what you're trying to do, man.
Keep
You're
you
trying
off
to fuck me
balance
all the time. Yeah, I think. I mean, I just have to cite Shelley on this, who said that poets are the unofficial or unadorned legislators of the world, which is to say that they're the legislators of our consciousness as a as a species and as a people. And to the extent, I mean, that's really what Trilling meant by the idea of the liberal imagination, the liberal mind that's always reinventing itself. And to the extent that writers have that responsibility in a civil society, they are, whether they know it or not, all writers contribute in their own small way to the transformation of people's consciousness. And for me, the greatest example of that is arguably the greatest genius in the world of English letters, which is Shakespeare. Shakespeare completely revolutionized not just the English language, but human consciousness. I mean, we are all indebted to Shakespeare, whether we recognize it or not. He invented partly what it means to be modern. And I don't have like an hour to explain that in full, but I think that statement should stand as is.
Certainly among this crowd.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I love Shakespeare, and he definitely was a genius. The way he was perceived in his time, whatever he was, in reality, like, I wonder how competitive he was and, what he wanted. Did he want to make plays that idiots in the pit fucking threw tomatoes at? I mean, I guess you could say he's the originator of Rotten Tomatoes.
He did have a fairly well-documented rivalry with Christopher Marlowe, who was his contemporary at the time. I think he and Marlowe had a competitive relationship until Marlowe was unceremoniously stabbed in a bar fight by a secret agent of Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth.
I guess it kind of seems like the competitiveness nowadays is based on moral disagreement.
I think it happens in the moment. I think it happened. Like, I think what social media and the internet has done is like Hemingway. If we're gonna, I mean, I know, but like Hemingway and Gertrude Stein, for example, like Hemingway owes a great debt to Gertrude Stein, but then they had like a falling out, and then like when he published A Movable Feast, like he trashes Gertrude Stein in A Movable Feast, and it's like that's the old way of doing things. Is like when you're feeling competitive, or if you have beef with someone, you wrote a fucking novel and you trash them in the novel. And like,
yeah. Oh, and it's interesting you bring that up, because in The Last Dance, one of the like a big feature of The Last Dance was how after the Bulls lost to the Pistons 2 or 3 straight years in the Eastern Conference Finals, and then finally beat them, and how Isaiah Thomas and Lambeer and everyone on the Pistons just walked off and didn't shake hands with them. And Jordan's really pissed off about that, and it's one of the reasons why they had beef the rest of their lives. But if you go back, the Celtics did the same thing to the Pistons when the Pistons dethroned them, and like that happened before. And again, like, I guess like it comes down to things are changing. I mean, is it for the better that things are more transparent and that you can get on social media and it's more about who said what yesterday? And like, yes and no. I think that's another conversation. But just overall, like, I do wish, like you said, Devin, I wish it was more about the work. I wish it was more about the craft. I wish it was more about, is it fucking good? That's the real question, right? Like, that's the question we should be talking about, but we're not. And then we could have people having like, friendly jabs at each other. I mean, was Hemingway friendly with Stein? Like, I don't know. But like, was anyone going to die over their feud? No. Like, I think I have fun hearing that, I love hearing Jordan, like, prattle off his list, quote unquote. It's fun. It's fucking fun. I want to see people driven to their best. I want to see them push the limit, And on social media, it's like you're not seeing that. You're seeing, did someone phrase this comment steeped in some moral quandary?
To keep this in the realm of literature, if you look at the way the most recent genius of our literary age has been treated, and for me, I think the greatest genius of the last age is probably Wallace. And if you look at the way he's treated these days, I mean, after he died, he was given angel wings, like so many people who die too young. And he was deified for a few years after his death. But that's really changed. There's been a sea change against Wallace in the past couple of years. And some people really hate him now. If you go on social media, there's just so much slander and vitriol against him. One thing that it all has in common, though, is that none of it's about the work. It's all about like how nasty he was to one of his ex-girlfriends, right? It has nothing to do with his actual genius. has to do with his flaws as a man.
You'll see criticisms about his work, but and some of them are fair and some of them are not. But no one's going to come out and say Wallace
Because they
was a
can't,
shit
right?
writer.
It's not
Everyone
a
knows he was a
defendable
genius.
statement.
Yeah, yeah. There's nothing to say about that. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, like whether it's him, whether it's anyone, I'm more interested in what they wrote. Like to be honest, like because no one's going to be pure. And again, I want to bring up The Last Dance because this is the prism through which we're talking about all of this, and when Jordan's gambling addiction was unearthed, that was the thing that they used to try and bring him down, right? Like that was and they said you have a gambling addiction, like blah blah blah, and it's all this extraneous bullshit that has nothing to do. Which really, his gambling actually was just part and parcel, part of his, what he called, like, do I have a gambling problem? No, I have a competition problem. Like, he said, like, am I hawking my championship rings, my house, to feed my gambling addiction? No, I'm not. Like, I'm rich as fuck and I can throw down $1 million on a golf game. I just happen to be able to do.
There's a story that they tell in the documentary where like the guys who were part of like the road crew, like the security guys, when they would be on the jet together, like the security guys would play cards at the front of the plane and they'd be playing for like $1 or $2 a hand.
No, it was actually other players. It was players who are also rich, right? Like they're also rich, but they refuse to play for that much money.
But like the big boys in the back were playing like hundreds of dollars per hand, but like the guys at the front were playing like $1 or $2 a hand. And Jordan went up and played with them. And they're like, why are you up here playing with us and taking like our nickels and dimes? And he's like, because I want to beat you and take your money from you.
Yeah, he said, because I want to say that I have your money in
vicious,
my pocket.
That
was what he said. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I love it.
And I love it.
I don't
Genius,
know.
Though,
it's just like, I love it. And speaking of genius, I think you wanted to talk about this, Jared, but like going back to that, I mean, you call it a trance state, right? That was the way that you framed it.
Well, I was thinking about that before we started because I was thinking about what we were going to talk about. And I think that one thing that both we can imagine is shared by both artistic genius and athletic genius is this idea like of the trance state when you're like in the zone. That's something that's very difficult to describe to people, but I think all of us have maybe at least touched it or felt it even for, a little bit in our own work. And there is something about that state of, unself-conscious flow, whatever you want to call it, like athletes call it being in the zone or, there is something about that. There is something to that. I think that's true. Yeah, there is something about that for both art and athletics. Is that like that feeling of the trance state?
Yeah.
And I think that probably has something to do with genius because I think you need to be able to tap into that.
Yeah, I honestly think it ties straight back into what I was saying about Jordan doesn't have any prejudice in his mind toward relating what is going to happen in the game in front of him or the play in front of him to what happened yesterday or the year before or what will happen like the next day or a year from now.
I think that we all experience the trance state in the presence of genius. I mean, we have all felt, you may not normally call it a trance state, but when you're reading a book, when you're reading a novel and you're so involved in the story and you're not thinking about anything outside of, the covers of that book. I mean, you have the same experience watching a really intense basketball game where you are so keyed into the action and you're ready to break something, when the ball doesn't go in the net. I mean, I don't know if that's exactly the same thing as, as an athlete who's in the zone or however you want to call it, or a writer who's really kind of communing with something as they're moving the pen across the page. But I think, well, certainly as a writer, I mean, so much of my motivation to write comes from my experiences reading, just sitting alone with a book and, and going off somewhere else, somewhere that, I'm not physically, where you're kind of transcending your physical self. At least that's what reading a really good book feels like to me.
There are some great works that we have to assume were created in that place, books or poems that were written in a kind of fever, a kind of fugue state. I mean, like, how on earth does Mary Shelley write Frankenstein and the amount of the window of time that she wrote if she didn't just sort of let herself go? Or if you were to read Whitman, Howell, absolutely, Whitman, Ginsberg, one of Ginsberg's favorites, Leaves of Grass, Blake. I mean, there is a lot of it. Especially, I'm glad you brought up William Blake, of course, because I mean, to him, it was a transcendent act. He was sort of making his own connection. He was laying line between him and the divine, because he was driven by that need to transcend through language. It shares a lot with sporting greatness, and it shares a lot with, I would even go so far as to say, religious fervor, right? As a half-lapsed Catholic, like, it's difficult when you walk into a church not to feel the presence, right? The architecture and the stained glass. It is when you commune in that way and allow yourself to just sort of go along with it. It is almost like what one can imagine an oracle at Delphi, right? Sort of breathing in toxic cave fumes and then writhing around, right? Something spiritual, something ecstatic about creation, or about playing basketball at the highest level, right? Just sort of the shutting off of the conscious mind.
That's probably one of the reasons writing is so fucking hard, is because it's a paradox. Like in sport, you literally can have muscle memory, right? Like you can like even the triangle that Phil Jackson ran with the Bulls was like one of the most complicated offenses, ever conceived. And there were like something like 50 something possible outcomes from running it. But if you run it enough times, like, those outcomes aren't something you remember. They're just something that naturally comes from running it. And you practice your jump shot, you practice passing. You can literally play, like, it is literally beneficial to your cause to play unconscious. But to write a book, you have to consciously consider certain things. And I feel like that paradox makes things difficult, because, you have to pre-consider the things you need to do in order to get to that state that you talked about.
Yeah. George. It's funny too. Whenever someone who, is not an artist or is not particularly literary asks me about writing, and they say things like, is it hard? Like, how do you come up with it? Like, you sit down and like it comes to you. Like, people are curious about the process naturally. And for people who they are, not very artistic, or like, especially if I know if they like sports, I always liken the experience as being like a golfer, because golf is of all sports probably the most mental, or probably the most intellectual game, the most heady game, certainly. And I tell people, like, you can go to the driving range every single day and hit like hundreds and hundreds of balls, so that when you get to the tee, you can not think about it, right? You need to put in the conscious effort, so that when the moment comes, the conscious effort evaporates and you become zen. And I think writing is a lot like that. You go to the gym every day. All of us went to a creative writing program. You spend years building the chops, and you do that so that when the time comes, to write the next chapter or write the next paragraph, you can kind of like sink into the pool. You can kind of embrace the oceanic feeling and not think about it, because you've done all that work. It's already behind you.
Yeah. And honestly, to come somewhat full circle, I think that's like that essentially encapsulates the transfer of motivation, or the motivation, whatever you want to call it. The inspiration that I got from The Last Dance was like, and back to what you were saying, Devin, about you missing the way you wrote before it was like an attempt to get published or whatever. That's what I realized when I watched that documentary. I was like, I feel like for a number of years now, I've kind of drifted away from this point that I've been trying to make that point, if that makes sense. and now, like, I saw that documentary and I was like, yeah, I need to set myself up to not get in my own way like I did before, or like as you start to, when you're trying to accomplish something and you want it too much or whatever, or there's, like Devin said, the networking and all that bullshit.
Yeah, and I think if there's one thing, since we all went to a creative writing program and we all had our own, struggles and our own experiences with it, I think if there's one thing that I would want to impart to students who are going through a creative writing program and learning the craft, is just telling them to get out of their own way, which is what you need to be able to do.
A hard lesson, though, one that takes years to really learn how to do. I mean, it is difficult to get out of one's own way. One of the most difficult things about writing is learning how to understate something and not piling on, but it does take a removal of the self and a kind of a dissociation with being the creator occasionally.
Yeah, in a way, it's like playing for the win instead of for yourself. Like, in a team sport, it's like highly similar. Realizing how to win and not to, like, just pile up like personal accolades or whatever.
We ain't talking about practice.
Our
We talking
producer has
about the
joined
game.
us.
Yeah,
We're talking about practice,
practice.
not a game. Not the game I love. Our producer has joined us and is probably getting ready to tell us that we should shut the fuck up or something. Okay, I'm going to sign off now. So everyone shut the fuck up. Okay, that's it for today's episode. It was lovely to be back to rejoin everyone. We're putting the episodes back up. This is going to be the 51st, so 1 through 50 are slowly coming back. I believe we're up to 20. I don't know where we'll be at when we put this one back up. But anyway, yeah, so you can go check them out at animalriotpress.com. But if you like what you heard, please subscribe and review on whichever platform you're listening. You can get in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Animal Riot Press, or through our website, as I said, animalriotpress.com. This has been the 51st episode of the Animal Riot podcast with your host, me, Brian Birnbaum, and featuring Jared, Marcel, Pollen, Seth Katz, Devin Kelly, and George Sawaya. Transcripts for our deaf and hard of hearing animals are provided by Jonathan Kay and were produced by, drumroll, Katie Rainey. See you later, you filthy animals. All right. Excellent work, everyone.
That was great, guys.
Okay.
That was really good. I give it 3.9 stars now.
All right.
Yes, sir, it's the burn. Bombing on y'all and getting gully as a fern.